Good evening, YouTube. This is going to be the second in what will hopefully be a series of assessments looking at the joints up from the big toe joint. The midfoot is a rather more complicated system than the big toe joint, which is why the big toe joint was a good one to start with. Before we can really get into the palpation of the joint and the movement and through finding all the different joint spaces and whatnot, we really need to address a very significant and often overlooked element of midfoot biomechanics, which is the difference between forefoot varus and forefoot supinatus. A lot of people use these terms interchangeably. A lot of people don't recognise what forefoot supinatus is and just call everything inverted forefoot varus, which is very wrong. So before we can actually come on to assessing the midfoot, I think we need to spend a little bit of time just trying to unwrap the difference between the two. As is my habit, I have made a very inexpensive model. This is a inverted commas normal foot. It may look like two Podotech boxes held together with an arrow, but it's a foot. The back section there is the talus and calcaneum. The interface between the two is, I'm describing as a mid-tarsal joint. The mid-tarsal joint is very often thought of as a cluster of joints. It's everything between the rear foot and the forefoot, but we're going to treat it as just one joint that rotates around a longitudinal axis, just for the sake of simplicity. And the forefoot, the medial column, comes down there. Your classic bog standard forefoot supinatus, which makes up about 86% of all the feet you will see, looks like this. The rear foot, when it is in its neutral position, the mid-tarsal joint is inverted. That means the medial column is off the ground, the big toe joint is off the ground when you put the subtalar joint into neutral. It's usually an acquired situation. Generally it's thought to be because the rear foot everts, pronates, and when the rear foot everts, it forces the forefoot into inversion, and according to Davis' law, the soft tissues will contract in that position if it's put there long enough and hard enough, and you'll end up with that as a non-weight bearing situation. Demonstrated the same thing on a skeleton. The rear foot, the calcaneum and the talus being in neutral, the inversion happens at the mid-tarsal joint between the talus and the navicular, or between the joint down, and the big toe joint is off the ground when the patient is standing up. A forefoot varus is an entirely different animal. I've illustrated this by cutting a wedge out of the rear foot complex on the model. So I've actually inverted the talus as it's presented to the forefoot. So what we now see, if we were doing this on a skeleton, I can't actually show you this because what I'd have to do is to cut the talus across its neck and rotate it by a few degrees and then stick it back on. Forefoot varus is thought to be caused by an incomplete derotation of the talar neck during embryological development, according to Valmassi. So it's actually a deformity of the talus itself rather than of the joint. So with a forefoot varus, you can see that the mid-tarsal joint is actually still perfectly congruent. The mid-tarsal joint is not inverted at all. However, because the talus is inverted, the effect is the same. The medial column is off the ground. The big toe joint is off the ground when the rear foot, when the calcaneum is in neutral. It was described in Root, slightly confusingly, I think. And there's a piece in here which is very often missed. Mid-tarsal joint deformities, and he's talking about forefoot valgus and forefoot varus here, alter the position at which the forefoot locks against the rear foot while the mid-tarsal joint is fully pronated. That bit's really important because that bit is very often overlooked, and the subtalar joint is maintained in its neutral position. In a foot with a forefoot varus deformity, the plantar surface of the forefoot remains, remembering remains when it is fully pronated, inverted relative to the plantar surface of the rear foot, or in other words, relative to the ground. So, in other words, the root definition of forefoot varus, and since he was the guy that basically invented it, this is a definition I think we have to view as authoritative, is that it's the position where even when the mid-tarsal joint is fully pronated, the forefoot will still not be on the ground when the rear foot is in neutral. Another point here, which I just will signpost, it talks about the mid-tarsal joint being fully pronated. The mid-tarsal joint is pronated when you move the big toe joint down, and supinated when you move the big toe joint up. So, in other words, just to be really confusing, when the rear foot pronates, it causes the forefoot to supinate. And conversely, forefoot pronation in weight bearing will cause rear foot supination. So when we're talking about pronating the forefoot, we're either talking about loading the lateral column, pushing up under the lateral column, or pushing down on the medial column. There have been lots of studies done into the origin of forefoot varus and what it actually is made up of. Both Luffler and McPoyle did some cadaver studies where they took lots of cadavers. They looked at the forefoot to rear foot relationship, and then they dissected them and investigated what the rotational characteristics of the talus were to see if the forefoot varus was genuinely caused by a derotation of the talar neck. And what they found was that in almost all cases, it wasn't the forefoot varus. There was no rotation in the talar neck in those feet with forefoot inversion. But then when you look at their backgrounds, their methodologies, both of them defined forefoot varus as a clinically as a non-weight bearing inversion of the metatarsal heads relative to a vertical bisection of the calcaneus in subtalar joint neutral. They did not mention while the mid-tarsal joint is fully pronated. So they were considering any foot which had a forefoot inverted relative to the rear foot to be a forefoot varus, which is obviously a definition but not the one proposed by Root. So it's unsurprising that they found that most of these feet didn't have rotated tali, because what they were looking at in all probability was feet which had forefoot supinatus rather than forefoot varus. Another interesting study on this was one by Garbulosa, who looked at tried to get some normative data in an asymptomatic population, and he found that out of 234 feet that they measured, 86% of them had forefoot varus. And I believe from memory the average over the population was about 5 to 8 degrees of forefoot varus. But once again, they were using inversion relative to the rear foot as the criteria for forefoot varus. They were not using the definition from Root, the inversion of the forefoot rear foot relative to the rear foot when the forefoot is maximally pronated, nor were they distinguishing between that and forefoot supinatus, which is, as I said, an acquired deformity. So just in summing up then, forefoot varus is an inverted forefoot relative to the rear foot, and a forefoot supinatus is also an inverted forefoot relative to the rear foot. Relative, I can't spell very well. So you can't say from a photograph whether it is a supinatus or a varus. In a varus, the talar neck is rotated, is inverted. According to Valmassi, it's caused by an incomplete derotation of the talar neck during embryological development. Whereas in forefoot supinatus, the talus is perfectly normal, as McPoyle found when he did his cadaver studies. In a forefoot varus, the MTJ, the mid-tarsal joint, is considered to be congruent is considered to be in a neutral position. The rotation is all happening at the level of the talus. It's not necessarily any inverted position at the joint, whereas in forefoot supinatus, the inversion is all coming from the position of the mid-tarsal joint. Of course, if forefoot varus is to do with the shape of the talus, that's congenital. It's something that you will be born with. Whereas forefoot supinatus will be acquired. It will be brought on by forces. The next statement is slightly sort of circumspect. Forefoot varus could reasonably be expected to cause pronation. If the forefoot is inverted to the rear foot, even when it's maximally pronated, even when the windlass kicks in and plantar flexes the first ray, the subtalar joint must pronate to a degree to get the forefoot on the ground. And of course, the further over the subtalar joint goes, the more energy it takes to bring it back, as we will talk about when we come on to the subtalar joint. Whereas in a forefoot supinatus, it's the other way around. The foot pronates, the rear foot pronates, and that causes inversion moment around the mid-tarsal joint. So the forefoot supinatus is actually caused by the pronation rather than the cause of pronation. The next two are in italics because they are slightly dubious. Forefoot varus is considered to be non-correctable. The test for it, I believe, is that you place the foot into subtalar neutral and push down on the big toe joint. If you can get the big toe joint on the ground, then it's considered to be forefoot varus. And forefoot supinatus is considered to be correctable because if it's caused by an inverted position of the joint, then if you evert the joint and put it back to its central position, it should correct it. Having said that, as we know with Davis' law and later on Wolff's law, if a joint is in a particular position for long enough, then it will tighten up, and it is entirely possible to get to the stage where you have a forefoot supinatus that you cannot correct. How you would tell that from a forefoot varus without the benefit of an x-ray, I do not know. If anybody does, I'd love to hear it. Forefoot varus is generally considered to be osseous, to be bony, whereas forefoot supinatus is soft tissue, at least in the first instance. Although, once again, if a soft tissue contracture causes a joint to adopt a certain position, we've all seen arthritic change kick in and for it to fuse. That doesn't make it forefoot varus. And finally, forefoot varus is very, very rare. You are looking at 1 to 2%, if that, of cases of feet you will see will have forefoot varus, whereas forefoot supinatus is ridiculously common. As I mentioned, 86% in Garbulosa presented with forefoot supinatus. So a degree of forefoot supinatus could be considered normal in the statistical sense. I should give a shout out to Craig Payne, who has been banging his head against the forefoot supinatus, forefoot varus wall for as long as I've known him. He wrote a very excellent article on it. I shall put the link in the description to the video, and I would warmly recommend that if any of this video is unclear, which is very possible, you pop along there and check it out. Okay, thank you very much. The next video will be on the clinical assessment of the midfoot, and how to identify all the joints and where they are and how they move. Many thanks for watching.